4 minutes. For 4 long minutes, the world heard nothing. No voices, no telemetry, just dead silence on the radio. Somewhere high above the Pacific, the tiny capsule of Apollo 13 was slamming into Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. If its heat shield was even slightly cracked, if its angle was even slightly wrong. If anything was wrong, millions of people on live TV were about to watch 3 men burn to death, in real time. But here's the twist. Just reaching this moment was already a miracle, because 4 days earlier, their spaceship had effectively died in deep space. This is how 3 astronauts turned a dying moonship into a lifeboat and cheated death 250,000 miles from home. And to understand how they ever got to that 4-minute silence, we have to go back to where it really started. By April 1970, going to the moon was no longer science fiction. Apollo 11 and 12 had already landed. The world was starting to get bored. Apollo 13 was just another moon mission headed for Fra Mauro, a rugged highland scientists loved, but the public barely noticed. Their spacecraft was 3 machines flying as one. The command module, Odyssey, the cone-shaped capsule where the crew lived, and the only part built to survive re-entry. The service module, a cylindrical workhorse packed with oxygen tanks, fuel cells, and the big main engine. It powered and pushed the whole stack. The lunar module, Aquarius, the spidery lander meant to carry 2 men down to the moon's surface, then blast back up to rejoin Odyssey. The crew in 1 line each. Jim Lovell, calm, veteran commander, had already orbited the moon on Apollo 8. Fred Haise, first-time astronaut, trained to land Aquarius on Fra Mauro. Jack Swigert, command module pilot and last-minute replacement, pulled in after a measles scare, sidelined the original pilot. On April 11, 1970, the Saturn V thundered off the pad at Kennedy Space Center in a tower of fire. Minutes later, Apollo 13 was in orbit. Soon after, they turned Odyssey around, pulled Aquarius out of its shroud, docked the 2, and fired away toward the moon. 3 quiet days stretched ahead, checklists, experiments, a TV broadcast almost no one watched. Everything looked normal. Until a small, routine request lit the fuse on one of the most famous survival stories in history. About 56 hours into the mission, on the evening of April 13, the crew had just finished a light-hearted TV tour of the spacecraft. They floated, they joked, they showed off the shrinking blue Earth outside the window. Then Mission Control in Houston called up a simple instruction. 13, we'd like you to stir up your cryo tanks. In the service module were 2 tanks of super cold liquid oxygen. That oxygen fed the fuel cells that made electricity and water. Every so often, small fans inside would stir the tanks to keep the readings accurate. It was maintenance, nothing more. Jack Swigert flipped the switch. Seconds later, the ship jolted. A sharp bang, a twist, warning lights flashed, gauges swung wildly. Houston, we've had a problem here, Swigert said. Lovell came in clearer. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt. In Mission Control, rows of controllers stared at their screens. At first, it looked like messy data. Then a pattern appeared that should have been impossible. 1 oxygen tank pressure, 0. The other tank's pressure, falling fast. Fuel cells dropping offline. Ship's power bleeding away. In low Earth orbit, you can abort and come down quickly. In lunar orbit, you can fire your main engine and head home. Apollo 13 was in the worst place possible, deep space between worlds. No atmosphere to fall into, no space station to dock with, no rescue craft. Lovell looked out the window and saw a steady stream of white particles spewing into space. Houston, we are venting something out into space. It's a gas of some sort. It wasn't some random gas. It was their oxygen, their life support, and their power source, disappearing into the void. Without that oxygen, their ship could turn into a drifting coffin in minutes. At first, controllers hoped it was a bad sensor, a glitch, but the numbers settled into one brutal reality. One oxygen tank had exploded. The remaining tank was leaking. Without oxygen, the fuel cells would soon die. Without fuel cells, Odyssey would lose almost everything: power, water, heat, electronics. Inside the command module, lights dimmed, fans spun down. The cabin began to cool. Odyssey, the ship meant to keep them alive and bring them home, was turning into a frozen coffin. Its onboard batteries were only meant to be used briefly, during re-entry, 3 days later. If they used them now, they'd have nothing left when it really counted. They had trained for aborts. They had trained for failures. Nobody had trained for this. On the ground, Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team had to choose fast. Still docked to the nose of Odyssey was the lunar module Aquarius. It had its own batteries, its own oxygen, its own small engine, its own guidance computer. But it was designed for just 2 men, for about 2 days, near the moon, not 3 men, not 4 days, and definitely not deep in interplanetary space. Even so, it was the only card they had left. They gave the order. Shut Odyssey down, move into the lunar module, turn the lander into a lifeboat. And that created a whole new problem. Could a machine built to land on the moon keep 3 men alive long enough to get them around it, and somehow back to Earth? Zero gravity makes everything look slow and graceful, even panic. The 3 men pushed through the tunnel into Aquarius, grabbing handholds, pulling equipment, tripping over floating checklists. They had to wake a spacecraft that wasn't supposed to be turned on for another 2 days. Inside the LM, they powered up its guidance computer, switched comms over, copied crucial navigation data, and started shutting almost everything down in Odyssey to save its batteries for re-entry. Every watt they burned now was a watt they wouldn't have later, when a dead command module would mean a dead crew. On the ground, engineers had to solve 2 lethal problems at once. How do you keep 3 men alive in the lunar module, far beyond its design limits? And how do you get them home without using the damaged main engine? Life support first. Aquarius had plenty of oxygen, good news. Everything else was bad news. Power, the LM ran on batteries. Once drained, they were gone. Every light, every fan, every beep from a computer had to be argued over. Water needed to cool the electronics and keep the crew from dehydrating. There wasn't enough to do both comfortably. Carbon dioxide. The scrubbers were sized for 2 men, not 3, and for a shorter mission. Then the trajectory. Apollo usually flew a free return path. If something went wrong, the ship would naturally loop around the moon and fall back to Earth. But earlier course tweaks to set up the landing had nudged Apollo 13 off that perfect free return. The obvious move, spin around and fire the main engine on the damaged service module for a fast turn home, was too risky. If that engine failed mid-burn, it could leave them on a path that missed Earth entirely. So Mission Control chose the slower, colder option. Let the ship swing around the far side of the moon, using its gravity to bend their path back toward Earth. Use the lunar module's small descent engine for a few carefully timed course corrections. In most survival stories, there's at least a piece of land to aim for, a coastline, a mountain, a tree line. Here, their only shore was an invisible corridor in Earth's atmosphere, hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, that they had to hit exactly. And even if they managed that, there was something deadly already building up in the air around them. With Aquarius fully powered, Odyssey went dark. Swigert sealed the hatch. The command module became a cold metal shell, waiting for a job 3 days in the future. The LM, already tiny for 2, now held 3 men, emergency gear and extra equipment dragged in from Odyssey. It felt even smaller. To stretch the LM's limited power, cabin lights were turned down or off. The computer ran only when absolutely necessary. Heaters were cut to the bare minimum. The temperature dropped toward freezing. Condensation coated the walls and wires. A ship designed to stay warm and dry now felt like the inside of a fridge. Water became a slow torture. Earlier missions used almost 2 liters per astronaut per day. Here, each man got less than a quarter of that. They sipped instead of drank, and dehydrated food was hard to swallow. Some water couldn't be touched at all. It was locked into cooling systems, keeping vital electronics from overheating. Their bodies ached from cold and lack of sleep. Fred Haise developed an infection that made everything hurt. Dehydration and exhaustion hit all 3 men. Every move took effort. They tried to sleep in suits, gloves, and hats, shivering in cramped corners. But the cold and noise made real rest almost impossible. But the most dangerous thing in the cabin wasn't the cold, and you couldn't see it or hear it. It was something their own bodies were creating with every breath. Oxygen keeps you alive. Carbon dioxide in high enough concentration quietly kills you. The LM had lithium hydroxide canisters to absorb CO2 from the air, but those canisters were sized for 2 astronauts for a shorter mission. Now there were 3 men, for longer than the system was built for. The math was brutal. The canisters would fill up before they reached Earth. The command module Odyssey had plenty of fresh CO2 scrubbers, but there was a ridiculous detail that now turned deadly. CM canisters, square. LM canisters, round. They did not fit the same sockets. The scrubbers were not interchangeable. If they couldn't solve this puzzle, the 3 men would only slip into unconsciousness and die, even with plenty of oxygen left in the tanks. Someone in mission control put it in the simplest possible words. We've got to find a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Engineers gathered in a conference room in Houston and dumped everything they knew the crew had in Aquarius onto a table. Cardboard covers, plastic bags, hoses, gray tape, a few tools. From that pile of random junk, they had to design a working adapter that would force air through the square canisters, using the LM's round hoses. Something 3 exhausted men could build in 0G. With no extra parts, no workshop and thick gloves. After hours of cutting, taping, and testing, they came up with something that looked terrible and worked brilliantly. A crude mailbox made from a flight plan cover, a plastic bag, a piece of suit hose, and lots of tape. Mission Control read the instructions up to the crew, line by line. In the cramped, cold LM, Haise and Swigert cut, folded, and taped while bits of plastic and paper floated around them. Lovell steadied the ship and kept an eye on systems. They plugged the adapter in. The fans pulled air through the ugly little box. On the ground, controllers watched one number, cabin code 2. If the fix didn't work, that line would keep climbing into the danger zone. Instead, the curve bent downward, then leveled off. The air at least was safe again. They had literally saved their lives with cardboard, plastic bags, and duct tape. If you like real survival stories where people have to improvise with whatever's in front of them, sometimes literally tape and plastic bags, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now Apollo 13 could breathe. But if their path back to Earth was even slightly wrong, re-entry would be their last moment, not their rescue. Navigation in space is usually precise and almost elegant. Gyroscopes track orientation, computers track speed, and above all, you trust the stars. Astronauts regularly took star sightings to correct any drift in the guidance system. It kept small errors from becoming big ones. After the explosion, that elegance vanished. The blast and the slowly venting oxygen had created a cloud of shiny debris around the ship, ice crystals, fragments, particles. When the crew pointed their optics at the sky, the instruments saw not clean points of light, but a messy field of glitter, real stars mixed with tiny bits of junk. If they took bad star readings, any course correction burn could introduce a small error that would grow over hundreds of thousands of miles. Too steep, they'd burn up. Too shallow, they'd skip off the atmosphere and sail back into space with no fuel left. Mission Control devised a series of minimal burns using the lunar module's descent engine. They let the moon's gravity do as much as possible and used engine firings only to fine-tune. One of the most famous burns was done almost the old-fashioned way. Lovell manually oriented the spacecraft so that the edge of the Earth lined up with a specific mark on the LM window. Haise timed the burn with a simple wristwatch. Swigert watched the engine and fuel readings. No fancy digital displays, just a blue-white Earth 200,000 miles away used as a makeshift gunsight. Every burn used precious fuel and power. Every burn narrowed or widened their chances of surviving re-entry. And all this time, there was a silent question hanging over everything. Even if they got the trajectory perfect, could they actually turn Odyssey back on after days of being frozen and dark? Time during a crisis stretches, minutes feel like hours. Inside Aquarius, the temperature hovered near freezing. Their breath fogged, condensation beaded on walls and instruments, and they tried to sleep wedged into corners in suits and gloves. But the cold, noise, and constant procedures made real rest almost impossible. Fred Haise's infection got worse. Dehydration and exhaustion hit all three men. Every movement took conscious effort. On the ground, Mission Control turned into a 24-hour war room. Different flight director teams rotated through, but no one's mind ever left the room. In simulators and mock-ups, engineers rehearsed scenario after scenario, chasing the same critical goal: find a way to wake Odyssey up without killing it. The command module's batteries held only a limited charge. The standard power-up procedure, the normal checklist, would draw more power than those batteries could spare. If they used too much, too fast, the system could crash, and there would be no second attempt. So in Houston, they did something extraordinary. They started with a completely cold, dark command module in a simulator. They measured the power draw of every step, every switch, every light, every circuit. They cut and reordered the sequence until they had a bare-bones resurrection procedure that kept the current under a razor-thin limit. When they were finally confident, they wrote that procedure down line by line. Later, that script would be read up to Jack Swigert, alone in the icy silence of Odyssey, as he tried to bring the dead ship back to life on the final day. But before that moment, the crew would get their first real look at what the explosion had done to their spacecraft. As Apollo 13 approached Earth, it was time to drop the dead weight. The normal sequence before re-entry: jettison the service module. Later, jettison the lunar module. Enter the atmosphere in the command module alone. Until now, the damage to the service module had been something seen only in numbers and computer readouts. When they separated from it, the crew turned Odyssey and Aquarius around and looked back. For the first time, human eyes saw the wound. One entire side panel of the service module was gone, blown out. Inside, twisted structures, shredded insulation, and exposed wiring hung where smooth metal should have been. Parts of the high-gain antenna were missing. The explosion had come dangerously close to the heat shield of the command module. It's one thing to know your ship is crippled. It's another to see its insides ripped open in the blackness of space and realize how close you came to being ripped apart with it. Then came a different kind of goodbye. They had to jettison Aquarius. The lunar module, the lander that was supposed to touch down on the moon, had instead become their lifeboat, their cold refuge, their only shelter for 4 terrible days. But it had no heat shield. If they tried to bring it into the atmosphere, it would tear the stack apart. They sealed its hatch, they blew the bolts, Aquarius slowly drifted away. For 4 days, it had been their only home. Now it was just another piece of metal, doomed to burn up unseen. Now everything depended on Odyssey again, a capsule that had been dark and frozen, brought back to life on a strictly rationed trickle of power. And its final test would be in fire. Re-entry from the moon is never gentle. Apollo 13 was aimed to hit the top of Earth's atmosphere at about 11 kilometers per second. At that speed, the air in front of the capsule compresses and turns into plasma. The heat shield chars and burns away, protecting the metal underneath. There is no try again here. Too steep, and the G-forces and temperatures can destroy the vehicle. Too shallow, and the capsule can skip off the atmosphere and head back into space. For days, controllers had been shaving and checking that entry angle with every burn, using up what little fuel they had. By the time Odyssey faced its blunt end toward Earth, the numbers were within the safe corridor, but the margins were miles thinner than anyone liked. As the capsule plunged into the upper atmosphere, a sheath of ionized gas wrapped around it. Radio waves can't pass through that plasma. Every Apollo mission had a communications blackout during re-entry, about 3 minutes of silence. For Apollo 13, the trajectory meant that blackout would be a little longer. This time, the whole world was paying attention. News networks carried the re-entry live. Families clustered around TVs. In mission control, no one moved. 3 minutes of silence passed. Nothing. 4 minutes, still nothing. In those long extra seconds, the worst scenarios crowded in. Had the heat shield been cracked by the explosion? Had the angle drifted, just slightly, despite all the burns? Had Odyssey broken apart in the upper atmosphere? Then, at just over 4 minutes, a voice suddenly cut through the static. "Okay, Joe." Jack Swigert's voice. Odyssey was alive, the parachutes deployed, bright against the blue sky. Apollo 13 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, within sight of the aircraft carrier USS Iwo Jima. Navy swimmers reached the bobbing capsule. The hatch was opened. Hours later, those 3 men stepped out of a cold, dark metal can and into warm air and sunlight. They were lighter, weaker, and colder than when they'd left. But they were alive. Surviving is one thing. Understanding why it was needed is another. NASA's investigation quickly focused on Oxygen Tank 2 in the service module, the one that had exploded. The story started long before launch. Years earlier, that tank had been dropped during ground handling. From the outside, it looked fine, but something inside was likely weakened. Later, a change in ground equipment sent higher than intended voltage to its heaters. A thermostat stuck shut, and during a test, the heaters were left on for hours. Inside, the wiring's Teflon insulation quietly overheated and degraded. On paper, the tank still passed. In space, when Swigert flipped the switch to stir the cryotanks, that damaged wiring sparked inside a high-pressure oxygen tank. In that environment, a tiny arc became an explosion powerful enough to blow out the side of the service module. NASA accepted responsibility. Tanks were redesigned. Procedures were rewritten. Later Apollo missions flew with safer hardware and stricter tests. Apollo 13 became known as a successful failure. They lost the mission but saved the crew. Most survival stories are about a few people cut off from the world. Apollo 13 looked like that. 3 men, alone in a crippled spaceship far from any help. But they were never truly alone. Behind Lovell, Haise, and Swigert were flight controllers in mission control, engineers in back rooms and simulators, technicians who knew every valve and wire, managers willing to rip up the plan and write a new one in real time. They didn't have laptops or cloud computing. They had slide rules, mainframes, and paper checklists. What they did have was a mindset. When the checklist doesn't work, write a new one. When the hardware doesn't fit, tape something together. When the environment gives you no mercy, make your own margin with discipline and creativity. The Apollo program continued. Apollo 14 flew to the moon less than a year later, carrying with it hardware and hard lessons from Apollo 13. Decades later, people still study Apollo 13 not just as a spaceflight anomaly, but as a masterclass in crisis management, engineering under pressure, and the psychology of survival when everything is stacked against you. 3 men, a broken spaceship, a lander turned lifeboat, and a planet full of people listening to 4 minutes of silence, wondering if they just watched 3 men die or pull off the impossible. Those 3 men had beaten vacuum, cold, hunger, thirst, CO2, and math. They hadn't beaten space. They had simply refused to let it have the last word. If this true story of Apollo 13 changed how you think about spaceflight and about what people can pull off when everything goes wrong, hit like. It tells YouTube this is a story worth showing to more people. And if you want more real survival stories, astronauts, explorers, or completely ordinary people facing impossible situations, make sure you subscribe. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told.